Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm John Denham, and I'm the Director of the Centre for English Identity and Politics here at Winchester University. For those of you who've not come across the Centre before, we've been going for a couple of years, and our interest is both in the reasons behind the rise in people saying that they identify as English and concern about matters English, and the way that that reflects in the political choices that people make and their view of the world. Over the last couple of years, as some of you will know, we've had a wide range of speakers. We've explored the governance of England, we've looked at the arguments around an English Parliament, the case for devolution to English cities and to English counties. We've had speakers looking at the diversity of modern England and the factors possibly shaping a much more multi-ethnic view of English identity. We've had speakers across the political spectrum: Tristram Hunt, when he was a Labour MP, Simon Heffer, the columnists, reflecting different perspectives and angles on the issue. Tonight, we're opening an area of debate which is new for the Centre, but one that's very important and could say in some ways is quite local to those of us here in Winchester. As most of you will know, it was walking in the water meadows in Winchester that inspired John Keats to write of a season of mists and mellow fruitfulness. I always think that if John Keats had had to cope with the M3 cutting across the valley and thundering through Twyford Down, the history of English romantic poetry might have been quite different. I have quite a personal connection with that motorway. The campaign against it was at its height in 1992, when I was standing for Parliament down the road in Southampton. And most reasonable observers judged that sufficient numbers of Southampton folk were so keen to dump the roads minister over that one particular issue that gave me the slimmest of majorities and certainly changed my life for the next 20-odd years. On reflection, that little vignette about central southern England raised a lot of questions that we should have stopped to think about at the time. Did modernity mean that pastoral images of England were no longer relevant at the time when most English people lived in cities or at least in large towns? What should the relationship between the environmental movement and party politics be? And perhaps, and particularly relevant to the interests of the Centre, we're in a world where the identities that people profess are increasingly local, and the global challenges that we face around sustainability and other issues are increasingly global. How do you square those circles? Well, we'll be asking a huge amount to ask our speaker in the next 30-40 minutes to address and answer all of those questions, but I can't think of a better speaker to open this important area of discussion. Ruth Davis has previously contributed an essay to a collection of papers that we published last year with the Fabian Society. More importantly, she was political director of Greenpeace from 2010 to 2015, and she's now the Deputy Director of Global Policy at the RSPB. And she's going to try and tease out some of those issues around the environment, place and identity for us this evening. So thank you very much, and please welcome Ruth Davis.
Thanks very much, John. As you'll hear, I'm a bit croaky this evening. I won't make too many apologies for it, but I think this might be the first lecture I've given that I kind of hallucinated in a slightly flu-like state over the course of the last couple of days. So it may be, I don't know, I hope it's got some elements of inspiration, but it may have some slight elements of incoherence, which I hope you'll bear with me one way or another. Before I kind of get stuck into that, I think I just want to reflect a little bit on what John was saying actually about the debate about the motorway outside Southampton, because the road campaigns of the, I guess they would have been the mid-90s, would that be right, John?
Early 90s.
Early 90s to mid-90s. That was the period in which I first got involved in environmental politics, and it was a very interesting time, I think, because at that point there wasn't such a very clear distinction in people's minds between a politics of resistance in the countryside that had a lot of its roots actually in people's kind of imagination around enclosure and around kind of toddler martyrs, and an environment movement that was very kind of globally focused around climate change. In those days actually there was a kind of radicalism that was capable of thinking about connection with the land and thinking about globalism at the same time. I think gradually those things drifted apart to the point where I only know half a dozen people now in the environment movement who could put those things back together again, and John's memories are very precious around that, because one of the things that I've found troubling and difficult in my life, I'm a profession, lifelong member of the Labour Party, is actually the dislocation between our concerns about social justice, economic justice, sense of identity and place, and environmentalism. And I'm going to touch on a few of those things as I go through my talk this evening. I want to just add one last coda on that, which is that I met one of the gentlemen who was responsible for the decision to allow the Newbury bypass and also to allow many of the other road schemes that went through, the cutting in Twyford Down being one of them, who said that these were the wisest decisions that he'd ever made in his life. He's an extremely progressive politician, I'm sure you'll all agree, but it is interesting that retrospectively he still sees the progress of modernity as absolutely unstoppable. I'd be interested to know what other people from a local background in this context think. So I've called the talk that I'm going to give this evening Exiles and Homecomings, England, Nature and the Common Good. And I want to talk to you a little bit today about how changes to the way that we manage land, own land, how we think about land, might be something that contributes towards the creation of a common English identity, a hopeful English identity for a new century. And in order to do that, I think we first probably have to spend a little bit of time digging around, if you like, in some of the ambiguities and complexities of English identity. I imagine that people in the room here will be familiar with some of John's work and some of the work of the centre here, so what I'm going to say won't necessarily come as a big surprise to you. But it's important, and I think we're talking about a nation, or the idea of a nation, or a people, or Englishness, or identity, to be totally comfortable with the concept that that is both a fantasy, a mixture of longing, a desire for a sense of belonging, and something that is about power. So nations are a strange thing, aren't they, one way or another? They're a kind of, projection of everything that we feel passionate about in terms of who we are, but they also connect themselves to institutions, whether that's governments or courts, or things like the common law of land ownership. And so they have this very potent mixture. And it's important for us never to forget, actually, that any nation is something that is composed of this combination of power and fantasy, because that makes it something that is both a huge potential power for good, but also a huge potential power for danger. And I don't have a discomfort with acknowledging the light and shadow that's associated with the idea of a nation. But if you don't start from that point, it's very difficult to have the conversation that flows from it.
Ruth,
Are you struggling to hear me a little bit?
We can hear her.
Okay, fine. Let me just talk to you, see if we can just get the sound.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't make my voice any louder because
you can't
I've
speak
got
more loudly, so we need to...
Yeah, I really do have a bit of a throat problem today. Sorry, folks.
The microphone would go closer to you.
I could maybe move the microphone a little bit or lean into it.
And lower the screen as well. Push it down.
I can try all sorts of things. Sorry, is everyone struggling to hear me?
Yes.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, I'll just lean in. So I'm going to just repeat the last sentence for the benefit of those people who didn't hear what I was saying, because I think it is important to dwell on this a little bit. So what I was saying was that I think before we have any conversation about Englishness, or indeed the idea of any national identity, we have to acknowledge a kind of human truth, which is that nations are made up of our fantasies, and the fantasy's connection with power and with institutions and with practicalities. So no nation really, exists indefinitely, endlessly in time. It's a thing that we imagine because we need to imagine it. But in doing so, we connect it with institutions that have real practical impacts on our lives. They're all about the contracts we make with each other. We connect a fantasy with institutions like parliaments or courts, or with concepts of land ownership. And so between us, if we're going to reimagine an idea of Englishness, we're going to have to do it with a collective sense of responsibility about that paradox and that ambivalence, that we have to acknowledge that we're writing and overwriting all kinds of fantasies about who we want to be and what kind of a country we want to be, at the same time as trying to do some practical things. And if we remember that, then we remember the potential for the idea of a nation or an identity being something that carries within it a potential for good and a potential for danger. For those of you who haven't done so, I highly recommend that you have a look at Ruth Davis's book, Lost Kingdoms. Has anybody read that? Do you know that book? It's a fascinating book. I don't always agree with him as a historian about everything, but he writes this beautiful history of kingdoms that have come and gone in Europe. And he writes about kingdoms that have come into being on the basis of a kind of flowering of idealism or practical necessity, or sometimes nations that have come into being very darkly and have disappeared in moments of suppressed genocide, or being swallowed up in bigger imperial projects. He's a brilliant writer. I highly recommend it. And one of the kingdoms that he talks about, which I want us to hold in our minds so that we're able to remember that England is a fantasy, he talks about the kingdom of North Britain. So at one point in our history, there was a kingdom in what we would think of as the United Kingdom right now, on the main island, if you like, or biggest island at least of the United Kingdom, that encompassed quite a lot of lowland Scotland and quite a lot of northern England. It was broadly Celtic in ethnicity and language, and some of that ethnicity still, some of that language still remains in the conversation, particularly of rural people in that part of the world. And it had its own traditions which sustained themselves over long periods, particularly around the retention of Catholicism during the Reformation. Now that matters to me at a personal level because I have a fantasy about the fact that I lived in the north until I was an 11-year-old girl. And so this little folk ditty that I've put up here is something that speaks very passionately to me. I'm going to put my glasses on and read it to you. A north country maid up to London had strayed, although with her nature it did not agree. She wept and she sighed and she bitterly cried. I wish once again in the north I could be. Oh, the oak and the ash and the bonny ivy tree, they flourish at home in my own country. Well, that passion for place, that passion about the north, is something that can spark a great deal of longing in me personally, because it speaks to me of a childhood that was lost when I moved from there, but it was also doubly lost later on in my life when my mother died. I know something about that longing though. I know that what it is a longing for something that didn't ever really exist. What I'm trying to do is recreate the thing that I wished I had. And I think if you think about what people from the north would say to me if I claimed that I was from the North Country, what would they say? I mean, they'd see a southerner whose family grew up in the south, who migrated temporarily to the north to take up a professional job and then migrated back down again. I have no authenticity in claiming to be from the North Country, and yet it speaks deeply to me of something. And I want us to hold that in our head while we think about the kinds of overwritings and appropriations of land and place that have made up the idea of being English. So who are the English? Well, they're a thing of fantasy, aren't they? The English actually have been overwritten, written, appropriated, done in, destroyed, resurrected more times than anyone could possibly imagine. Two recent appropriations and writing outs of history are ones that I think is particularly worth our while bearing in mind today. One is, and this is something that I think that John's project has been really diligent and very impressive in exposing, is the way in which actually over the last maybe 2-3 decades, the notion of Englishness in the minds of the progressive left has become associated with a kind of far-right ideology, but also the idea that the far right is in some way or another absolutely and totally absorbing of English identity. And as a consequence of that, it's been extremely difficult to hold on to the idea that there is a working class English identity which has its own traditions, its own learning, its own value, its own history of courage, that we owe to that working class movement, universal suffrage, the creation of trade unions in this country, that we owe to it many of the things that we value most in the country right now about the welfare state, for example. It's become very difficult to see that because the idea of a white working class person has become associated in our minds with the idea of a hooligan, with the idea of a racist. And the controversy around that has bedeviled the modern Labour Party, but is also actually bedeviling Englishness as a whole and our sense of identity. Something has happened where one group of people, actually a progressive, urban, middle-class left, have decided that they can spit out the idea of Englishness, and in doing so they've spat out actually the traditions of a whole class and a whole people. We've become quite familiar with that in one way, but I want to point to another place in which I think a similar kind of appropriation and crushing has taken place. And that's an appropriation and crushing of what has been the identity of rural England. If we think about what rural England is in our minds now, what does it mean to be English in the countryside? What it really means at the moment is a combination of absolute dispossession, because fewer and fewer and fewer people live in the countryside, and the overlaying of a very, very particular nostalgic chocolate box version of Englishness. So what's left in our imagination of rural England for too many of us is literally the stage set of A Midsummer Common Murder Mystery. That can't really be enough to encompass the entire bloody but also extraordinarily rich culture of British English peasantry. And yet that appears to be what we've been left with. Think to yourself about the way in which other countries speak about their folk culture, the way in which other countries celebrate their national dress, the way in which other countries think about their rituals and folk dancing, and then think about the way in which we as a country have thought about and spoken about English folk music and the traditions of Morris dancing, and all of those other things that actually have just become sort of quaint throwaways, quite nice to go and watch, but you wouldn't do it, would you, for most people. At the same time, that's created an almost silent underclass of people, working people, in rural environments. The Fabian Society recently undertook a big survey of potential working class rural and Labour voters, and asked them what they thought about how they were perceived by the wider world. Shouldn't come as a big surprise to you that pretty much anybody who's a working person in rural England right now thinks that the rest of the world thinks they're stupid. So if you have an accent that comes from the countryside, by definition that appears in our dominant culture to attribute to you an IQ of less than 110. Unlikely to be true, I think. Probably a cultural artifact, probably something to do with the way in which we fantasize about identity, and then the way in which we use identity for appropriation. We should also think at the same time about who owns that stage set, who owns Midsummer Common. Because a huge part of this story is not just about actually language, accents, dances, folk tales. It's really about land and dispossession. So, lost amongst all of that is the history of the fact that over maybe 200-300 years, the land of England has systematically flowed into the hands of a smaller and smaller number of people. It is incredibly difficult, as most of you know to contemplate the idea of a young person in southern England owning a house in the rural environment. Extraordinarily difficult to do. So we've ended up in a situation where we've got all of these overlays of identity, but actually what they really talk to us about is who owns land and who owns which land. And that's very difficult for us to have a conversation about. Because the idea that we might want to talk about land, the idea that we might want to think about the ownership of land and a connection to land and a feeling for land being something associated with identity has become very, very contested and hard space in a European country in a post-Second World War context. The left in particular finds it incredibly difficult to talk about the idea that actually a love of land associated with nationhood could be something that is constructive, something that is about homecoming, something that is about love, something that's about fertility. Because in the imagination of many of us, what we see is the idea of blood and soil. We see the notion that actually land associated with identity was the mythology and the rallying cry of Nazis. So it's very, very difficult for us to try to resurrect the notion that actually an association with identity and land is something that we can have as a positive part of English identity. That isn't true across the rest of the world. Almost all of those same people who find it difficult to talk about a relationship between land and identity and Englishness will probably find it relatively easy to talk about the relationship between land and identity and the struggles of indigenous peoples across the world for their rights. There's an absolute acceptance, a right acceptance of the idea that a relationship with land amongst indigenous communities is actually associated with a just struggle for social justice. So when we think about land and identity, the reality is that it's all about context. It's all about who owns what and is talking about what. It's not that we can't have that conversation, but if we want to have it in a politically meaningful way that feels as if it's progressive and inclusive, then we're going to have to do it in a way that embraces those people who have been dispossessed, that recognises the injustices that are the reality of identity in the countryside right now, and that recognises that most of us are dislocated from our ability to be able to have a relationship with land for the simple reason that the majority of people in this country live in urban environments and do not feel that they are associated with the countryside, don't identify with it, don't feel that they have any ownership of it. So our relationship with land has been carved out over many, many decades, indeed hundreds of years, by waves of possession and dispossession and exile. And at the moment it's very difficult to see any of that, because what we really have is an urban population that doesn't have access to the land and a rural population that is enjoying its possession in a way that is described in a nostalgic chocolate box fashion that closes down the possibility of any more redemptive and any more dynamic national identity. It doesn't really have to be like this. There are all kinds of ways in which this can potentially change. I've put that little comment on the left-hand side, which is John Clare speaking. Enclosure came and trampled on the grave of labour's rights and left the poor a slave. And birds and trees and flowers without a name all sighed when lawless laws enclosure came. The possibility still exists somewhere of very large numbers of people in England being able to return to the idea that they have a relationship with the land upon which we live. I think that emerges in all kinds of strange ways in our popular culture, ways that we don't probably even recognise because the traces of the history that underlie them are not that visible to us. How many of you watched The Detectorists? Great, it's a great programme, I love it. But underlying a part of that is a kind of almost mystical kind of longing for the possession of a kind of buried treasure in the English countryside. It's about the right to go and search. It's about the right to walk. It's about the possibility of a rediscovery of something. It's fundamentally about home. And it has rather serious political purpose attached to it, as most of you who watch it will probably understand the conversation that happened at the beginning of the last series about the ownership of the land that is used for the detecting. It's quite fundamental to this. And it goes back in my mind to a lot of underlying kind of working class memories, but perhaps collective folk memories of the notion of access, of the idea that actually at one point in our past, large parts of our land was common and we had an opportunity to be able to be on that land and to enjoy it and to have a sense of it being ours. I also don't think that it's impossible to imagine that people in exile and people longing for a home can find a home in a country that they have not necessarily been brought up in, but certainly where they don't necessarily have an ethnicity in common. When I was doing a little bit of slightly flu-ridden research for this talk, I was just looking up academic papers on the interest and perceptions of people from the BME area community about rural England, people's sense of what they did and didn't get from connection with the landscape and connection with rural England. And I found this, I thought, very beautiful story about British Indian people. I'm sorry if that's not necessarily the right terminology, but let's say people of Indian origin, British people of Indian origin, living in kind of suburban contexts, who by word of mouth had developed a real passion for the Lake District. And that passion, they said in describing to the researcher, emerged because it reminded them of the Lake District in India, and particularly it reminded them of the hill stations in India. And I thought, what an interesting and strange little piece of sort of exile culture that was, that there was a way of finding a home in England which had echoes of a previous home. Something in our landscape met a longing in people, perhaps a longing for a place that they'd never even been to. And then imagine the strangeness of that country, which was the victim of our colonial enterprises, also being a place where the English, good, bad, ugly, mostly bad and ugly, found a compensation for their homesickness in building hill stations in India, or at least taking them over, in exactly the places that reminded them of their own home. Homesickness is a very universal thing, and the potential to be able to create a home is also universal. A fantasy about belonging doesn't necessarily have to link itself back to hundreds or thousands of years of ethnicity. We have the opportunity to recreate the landscape in this country as a home for all of the people who live here. I'm taking a pause because my voice is going to run out in a minute. I'm just going to have a glass of water for a sec. Can you hear me properly? Yeah. Good. So, if there is something complicated, but something full of potential, something full of hidden pasts and possible futures in our relationship with the land, that's also intimately connected in my mind to the other kind of exile that we're suffering at the moment on a global level, which is an exile from nature. More and more studies will tell you that we're in a situation at the moment where we're losing two ways. We're not only losing species hand over fist, losing ecosystems hand over fist, putting ourselves in a situation where the loss of the other species of life on Earth is a terrible cultural tragedy, I think, for human beings, but also potentially beginning to challenge our ability to be able to maintain the fabric of where we live on Earth. We're putting ourselves at that risk at the same time that we're beginning to understand exactly how important that connection with nature actually is. On the right-hand side of this slide, or maybe the left-hand side of it, if you were looking at it, is something from a study of the use of words in English that shows the decline of the use of 3 words in the English language since 1910. Those words are fern, catkin, and buttercup. Look at that. That's a reflection of the fact that people are not seeing ferns and catkins and buttercups. And that's partly a reflection of the fact that they're disappearing from our countryside, but it is also the reality that the way that millions of our children are being brought up doesn't give them the opportunity to spend time with the natural world. I And yet, scientist after scientist, doctor after doctor, psychiatrist after psychiatrist, all piling after poets who've always known this, will tell us that a connection with the natural world, a feeling for nature, is a fundamental part of our health and well-being. The more we lose in this place, the less happy we are. And our disconnection with the land in this country is deeply and intimately linked to our disconnection with nature. Nothing in the world makes me sadder or more frustrated than the notion that somehow or another a connection with nature is a kind of outdated cultural artifact which we can afford to throw onto the bonfire of modernity. It's not borne out by the evidence. It's not borne out by the way that people feel when they're in the natural world. And what I think that's about is that we've become so uncomfortable with the notion of a connection with land that we have decided for expediency's sake, for the sake of something that is politically convenient, that we will junk our relationship with nature at the same time as we associate ourselves with an urban life, because we feel that that is the only life that can be diverse. That's the only life that can truly embrace the kind of liberal social values that we think are signifiers of who we are and who we want to be. Nonsense. And we're really going to suggest that it's impossible to hold social liberal values and at the same time long for and wish to have connection with the land and nature. That seems ridiculous to me, and I think our children will find it ridiculous once they've been deprived of things that we had the pleasure of enjoying when we were growing up. So that's the scene for some ideas that I want to give to you about what we could do about some of this. We live in a country that is a fantasy, because all countries are fantasies. Stitched over and over and over are ideas about what our relationship with land could be in England, and what our relationship with nature might be. And we're left with the possibility of trying to unpick and resurrect those bits of that story that we think are valuable. So how are we going to do that? How can we change this relationship? Well, the first thing to think about in that context is that whatever one may think about Brexit, it creates a moment of change. It creates the possibility of changing land values in this country. It creates the possibility of changing agriculture in the country forever, because the agricultural system of this country has been dominated by the Common Agricultural Policy ever since we went into the European Union. And as we leave it, if, for example, we were to withdraw the £3 billion of subsidies that is paid to farmers in this country every year, which I am not proposing we do, but if we were to do that, the values of land in this country will change absolutely dramatically. And land values in the country underpin all kinds of things. They underpin who owns land, but they underpin also who builds on land. So the fact that we're leaving the European Union, the fact that we have a housing crisis, bigger than one that we've ever faced during my lifetime, the fact that we can decide to reinvent our relationship with land and potentially reinvent our relationship with nature, means that this is a critical point for creating an idea of an Englishness that can be home, that can bring people home, that can create a sense of home for the future. Those three little graphs, I think, are illustrative of the point that I'm making, but also the potential that exists in this change around land use. So if you look at the share of the labour force working in agriculture since 1300, I know it goes a long way back. That bottom line, I think, is England. And you'll appreciate that the consequence of that is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of depopulation with a massive, massive plummet of the percentage of people living in rural England from about 1800 onwards. Bear that in mind when you look at that graph up the top there, which is trends in the presence of farm birds. Because as rural England has depopulated and as farms have consolidated, and as we've grown our food in more and more empty fields, as people have left, so the birds have left. Because nature in the rural environment has declined, actually, strangely enough, at a rate, or not a rate, but the same pattern as the numbers of people have been reduced from the rural environment. And then look at that third graph down there from the FT. That's the cost of land in England, rural land. So whilst people have left, nature has left, the value of land in this country has multiplied and multiplied. It has become the place that people put their money where they don't know where else to put it if it's safe. And the reason for that mostly relates back to partly agricultural payments straight into the hands of people who own that land, but overwhelmingly the fact that that land has potential value for housing, and we have decided as a country in most of England that we don't want to build houses on that land. And as a consequence, the value of every single hectare of land in the country has increased to the point where the only people who can afford to buy it are essentially hedge fund managers. So the vast amount of money that flowed into land in England over the course of the last maybe 15 years is money that has come straight out of the pockets of people in the City of London. This is the kind of thing that we have the potential to change if we start to unpick the agricultural system as it looks now. I have an idea that out of this we could create a beautiful, safe, welcoming home in England. I'm not suggesting a massive, radical land reform. I'm not suggesting throw the planning system in the bin. But I am reminding people that there are very, very few people in this country who wouldn't like the opportunity to own a small piece of land, to have an allotment, to have a small holding, to have some stake in the countryside. And there are very large parts of the countryside where it would be perfectly feasible for us to build new towns on land that was made cheaper as a result of interventions that we decided to make because of the issues around land ownership in this country. And in building those new towns, we wouldn't be desecrating the countryside, we'd potentially be welcoming people to a new homeland. Because actually, if you build new towns in the right way, they have the potential to have a far, far greater and more exciting wildlife and natural environment in them than many of the fields that we see right now. Now that's pretty tricky to say to an audience of people who probably own homes in the countryside. It's a pretty tricky thing to say. It's a tricky thing to say to farmers. But the reality is that we can't carry on living in an England where a tiny, tiny number of people own the great majority of land, and where the consequence is that for those other millions of people in the country, they don't understand how they can have a stake in the English identity that we've created. There is an absolute need for us to imagine and fantasise a different kind of England in which more people have a stake on the ground. I'm going to stop. And again, I'm going to read out two little poems and ask whether or not what we want to do and what we want to be is to become homesick for the future of England. Now this is from Robert Frost, who you guys will know is not an Englishman. Robert Frost is an American poet, but he has a very, very distinguished record of being, if you like, the midwife to one of the greatest English poets of the 20th century. If it hadn't been for Robert Frost, then Edward Thomas would never have really written a poem. And so he has a special place in the heart of anyone who cares about the English countryside. A poem begins as a lump in the throat, a sense of wrong, a homesickness, a love sickness. And then this other poem, which I think is almost an answer to what Robert has to say. I used to be homesick for places I had lived in, or for people I had loved. Now I have this craving for the future, as if homesick for the unknown. I'm going to stop there.